What if I told you there are documentaries so disturbing that governments tried to silence them? Real stories exposing crimes, hidden markets, and haunting truths considered too dangerous for the world to see. Let's start off with India's Daughter. A decent girl doesn't go out at night. A girl is far more responsible for what happens to her than a boy. Those were the words spoken by Mukesh Singh, who was one of the men convicted in the Delhi bus attack. He said them in 2015 during an interview for the documentary India's Daughter. The crazy part was that he didn't shout those words. He didn't even look angry. He was calm, almost casual, like he was saying something everyone should already agree with. And it was that line alone that made the documentary one of the most disturbing of the century. But what happened after its release may be even more disturbing than the crime itself. The story began on the night of December 16, 2012. Jyoti Singh, who was a 23-year-old medical student, had gone to see a movie with her friend Awindra. Afterward, they walked on what they thought was just a regular bus heading home. But instead, it became the setting for a crime that shocked the entire world. Both of them were attacked, but only Awindra survived, while Jyoti's injuries were far too severe. And after fighting for her life for about 2 weeks, she passed away in a Singapore hospital. The documentary, directed by Leslie Udwin, gave voice to Jyoti's parents, who spoke about her dreams and the future she had worked so hard for. It showed the pain in Awindra's eyes as he recalled that night, a story he will have to carry with him for the rest of his life. But the most unsettling part was hearing the attackers speak for themselves. Mukesh and others like him spoke without hesitation, explaining their actions as though they were justified. And if you thought that was twisted, the story gets even worse. Once the documentary was released, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi immediately moved to block the film. So with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, backed by the Indian central government and the Delhi police, they rushed to ban the documentary because they thought it might cause chaos. On another note, they also felt this documentary would give the attackers a platform, which in some ways could make sense. But at the same time, maybe that was the point in the first place, to expose men like Mukesh Singh. Others believe the real reason was that the film exposed a deeper truth the country wasn't ready to face. This wasn't just about 6 men on a bus. It was about a mindset deeply rooted in society, a mindset that normalized violence against women and essentially made excuses for it. But regardless of the ban, that didn't stop the story from spreading. Copies leaked onto the internet, students watched it in secret, the BBC broadcast it in the UK, and soon the entire world was watching. Instead of silencing outrage, the ban only made it louder because it felt like the authorities cared more about hiding the problem than fixing it. India's Daughter exposed a culture of silence and victim blaming. But the next documentary takes us into an even more twisted mind of evil itself: the act of killing. Imagine a man who once ended lives with a wire, standing in front of a camera, smiling and reenacting it like it was a scene in a movie. That's exactly what happened in The Act of Killing. In 2012, filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer released one of the most disturbing documentaries to date. He traveled to Indonesia to meet men who had carried out mass executions in the 1960s. The men who were involved were part of the Indonesian army and allied militias. At that time, anyone suspected of being a communist, such as students, teachers, union members, and even ordinary villagers, could be targeted without question. It's estimated that more than 1 million people lost their lives during this period. But here's what makes the documentary so unsettling. These men weren't hiding in shame. In fact, they were celebrated in their communities as heroes. And even back then, they were celebrated by the Indonesian government. General Suharto, who ruled from 1967 to 1998. And under his power, through the New Order regime, the massacres went on for decades and were not officially acknowledged as crimes. When Joshua gave them the opportunity to recreate what they had done for the camera, they didn't hesitate. But they didn't want to do it realistically. They wanted to do it as movies. So they wore costumes, they built sets, and they acted their violence as if they were starring in gangster movies or westerns. But what happens when someone who has bragged for decades finally comes face to face with his own actions? That's the moment that stunned audiences worldwide. One of the main people there, Anwar, even showed how he used to strangle his victims, smiling as he explained it, and then breaking into a dance to lighten the mood. In another sequence, the men staged a bizarre musical performance where they wore bright costumes, sang, and danced, celebrating their past violence as if they were part of a show. Watching these scenes was deeply disturbing because of how casual they made it feel. They boasted about what happened as though it was something to be proud of. And even deeper than the joy and celebration they shared was the lack of remorse. These men truly believed they did something great. The documentary exposed how the perpetrators saw themselves not as criminals, but as stars of their own story. The film was heavily suppressed in Indonesia, and authorities refused to allow a commercial release, making public screenings nearly impossible. Instead, it circulated underground, with secret showings and private screenings, all while the government has never fully acknowledged the mass violence. Even even after General Suharto fell in 1998, successive Indonesian governments have avoided accountability and resisted calls for truth and reconciliation. But as for the documentary, it was praised as groundbreaking on an international scale. Two of the greatest documentary filmmakers alive, Werner Herzog and Errol Morris, called it one of the most important films ever made. It went on to be nominated for an Academy Award and won dozens of international prizes. But the most powerful moment comes near the end. After hours of bragging, laughing, and reliving his past, Anwar suddenly breaks down. He heaves and gags, standing in the same spot where he once was responsible for countless deaths in that very place. For the first time, it seems like the reality of what he had done came crashing down on him. And that's what makes the act of killing unforgettable. It's not just a documentary about atrocities, it's a film about the psychology of evil and how human beings can commit and justify terrible acts, celebrate them, and only years later begin to feel the weight of what they've done. Now, if that wasn't disturbing enough, a documentary from China uncovered a very different kind of horror. Not mass killings, not even exposing a culture of silence and victim blaming, but mass disappearances, where government policy and cultural pressure combine to create a black market for children. This is the documentary of China's stolen children. In 2007, a documentary aired on Channel 4 in the UK that China immediately banned. It was called China's Stolen Children, and it exposed a dark secret that most of the world had never seen before: an underground black market where kidnapped children were sold and others were given up by their families. This also included families who sometimes turned to traffickers instead of putting their child through legal adoption. A major reason these child transactions happened was the one-child policy, combined with poverty. Introduced in 1979 to slow population growth, the policy limited families to just one child. In a culture where sons were preferred to carry on the family name and support parents, daughters were often given up in the hope of trying again for a boy. But that pressure and desperation created a system of exploitation where traffickers and corrupt officials took advantage of families, buying and selling children for profit. For families, this created an impossible choice. If they tried to keep their children and break the one-child rule, the punishment was severe. Families who kept more than one child faced heavy fines, called social maintenance fees, where they could be fined several times their annual income, and for poor families, this was devastating because they couldn't afford it. Parents who worked for the government or state-owned companies could lose their jobs, along with access to housing, healthcare, or schooling for the extra child. Some families tried to hide their extra child by not registering them with the government. But without registration, those children didn't exist on paper, and as a result, they couldn't go to school, get healthcare, or even legally marry later in life. These kids became known as Hai-Haisi, black children, because they didn't exist in official records. The documentary was directed by Jeza Newman, who pulled back the curtain on a disturbing side effect of China's one-child policy. It followed police units and investigators trying to track down missing children, while also showing the heartbreak of parents searching for their kids who disappeared, whether taken by traffickers or given up under pressure. Some families described how their toddlers were taken right from their homes or while playing outside. But what's even more unsettling is who was buying these children and why many weren't who you'd expect. They found themselves stuck in a nightmare with no closure and endless searching, hoping that their child might still be alive somewhere. What makes China's stolen children so disturbing is the psychology behind it. Many of the people who were buying children weren't even career criminals, but seemingly ordinary individuals. They were families who had been pressured by the cultural expectations and restrictive laws. The demand for boys didn't just fuel a black market, but it left behind broken families and children torn from their identities, where every transaction was a life destroyed and a life altered forever. China banned the film almost instantly after its release, though it still circulated internationally, while officials called it an attack on the country's image, saying it exaggerated the problem. But the real problem was actually the government's silence, and that alone said it all. By trying to erase the documentary, they confirmed just how desperate they were to control the narrative. On an international level, the documentary had split reactions between admiration on one side and outrage on the other. It raised questions about the human cost of population control. What happens when government rules conflict with cultural traditions? In China, the one-child policy collided with the preference for sons, creating a huge gender imbalance where boys far outnumbered girls. But the numbers were staggering. Thousands of children disappearing, mostly daughters, every year with the high possibility they might never be found again. What stays with you after watching isn't just the crime itself, but the ripple effects. The parents who never stop searching. The children who grow up in families they were sold into, never knowing their true origins or family. And the disturbing thought that even as the film was airing, the cycle was still continuing in hidden corners of the country. That's what makes China's Stolen Children one of the most haunting banned documentaries of the 2000s. It showed how government policy, cultural pressure, and human desperation combined to create a market for stolen lives, and then revealed how quickly the truth can be buried when a government doesn't want the world to see it. So far, these documentaries have hit us in different ways, but the next one is a hard pill to swallow. The Bridge. This was a documentary that left people absolutely devastated and shocked. It was called The Bridge, and it captured something that had never been shown before: real people in their final moments on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The filmmaker, Eric Steele, set up cameras throughout 2004, filming the bridge almost every day for an entire year. His goal was to document the people who came there, and then later to speak with the families and friends they left behind. This turned out to be one of the most controversial documentaries ever made. The Golden Gate Bridge is famous for its beauty, but it also carries a tragic reputation. For decades, it has been one of the most well-known locations in the world for people taking their own lives. Eric's cameras recorded more than 20 of these incidents during the year he filmed, and the footage was later combined with interviews that tried to give context to who these people were. One of the most haunting scenes involves a young man named Gene Sprague, who had struggled with mental health for years. But what his final moments showed us wasn't just his story, it pointed to a bigger silence that had been ignored for decades. The film shows him pacing back and forth along the bridge, clearly in conflict with himself, before finally making his decision. Later, his family and friends speak about the signs they missed and the pain of not being able to reach him in time. This is what made the bridge so unsettling. It didn't only show the final act, it showed the hours leading up to it, the hesitation, the fear, and the moments where intervention might have been possible. Then it gave the audience the perspective of those left behind, forced to relive the questions that would never have answers. When the documentary was released, the backlash was immediate. Some critics argued it was exploitative, that it crossed a line by showing real people's final moments on screen. Others defended it as a necessary conversation starter about suicide, mental health, and the desperate need for barriers on the bridge to prevent future tragedies. The documentary was banned or restricted in several countries. Even in the US, many theaters refused to show it. The debate it sparked was fierce. Does exposing something so raw help create awareness, or does it risk encouraging others? What makes The Bridge so disturbing is not just the footage itself, but the silence around it. And by the time the world finally paid attention, it was already too late for so many others. For years, people knew the Golden Gate was a magnet for tragedy, but few wanted to talk about it. But it was through this documentary that finally broke the silence, and it made the world confront a painful truth that was hiding in plain sight. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or leave a comment to suggest another.